I never believed in haunted houses. Growing up in a small town, you hear all the usual ghost stories, old mansions with tragic pasts, forgotten spirits that refuse to leave. I always thought they were just that, stories. That is, until the night my friends and I decided to spend the weekend at Blackwood Manor. Blackwood Manor was the most infamous house in our area, just outside of Boston, Massachusetts. It had stood abandoned for decades, its history shrouded in mystery. Some said the original owners, the Blackwood family, had disappeared under strange circumstances, while others claimed to have seen lights flickering in the windows late at night, despite no electricity running through the place. We didn't believe any of it. We were skeptics, a group of 5 college friends looking for a thrill. That Friday night, we packed our bags, grabbed some food, and drove out to Blackwood Manor. The road was long and winding, bordered by thick forests on either side, and as we got closer, an eerie fog began to roll in, making the atmosphere feel heavy. When the house finally came into view, even the most fearless among us grew quiet. The manor was massive, its windows dark, and its once beautiful architecture now crumbling under years of neglect. The iron gate creaked as we pushed it open, and I remember feeling the weight of the silence as we approached the front door. It was as if the house itself was waiting for us. As soon as we stepped inside, the air felt colder, damp almost, like the house had absorbed all the darkness and decay from the years it had been abandoned. The wooden floors creaked beneath our feet, and every breath seemed to echo off the walls. Dust covered every surface, and cobwebs hung from the ceiling like ghostly drapes. We split up to explore, flashlights in hand. The plan was simple: capture some footage, stay the night, and leave with a great story to tell. But it didn't take long for things to go wrong. I was in the kitchen with Jenny and Mark when we heard the first noise, a faint whisper, like someone calling out from the distance. We froze, straining to listen, but the sound disappeared as quickly as it had come. "You guys hear that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Jenny nodded, her face pale, but Mark shrugged it off. "Old pipes, probably," he said, though his expression told a different story. A few hours passed, and everything seemed relatively calm. We set up sleeping bags in the living room, and while some of us were nervous, we managed to laugh it off. That was until we heard the footsteps. They started around midnight. Heavy, deliberate footsteps from the second floor, moving slowly across the creaky wooden floors. All of us froze, staring at each other in disbelief. No one was upstairs. "Okay, who's messing with us?" Scott, the boldest of the group, called out, but no one was laughing. We decided to investigate, thinking maybe one of us had gone upstairs as a prank. But when we reached the top of the stairs, the air felt wrong, thicker, colder. The hallway stretched out in front of us, lined with old family portraits that seemed to watch our every move. And then, the footsteps started again, this time behind us. I spun around, shining my flashlight down the dark corridor, but there was no one there. My heart pounded in my chest, and I could see the fear in everyone's eyes. We weren't alone. We retreated downstairs, but the activity only intensified. Doors that had been shut were now wide open, and the once still air was filled with an unsettling pressure. Jenny screamed as she swore she saw a shadow dart across the hallway, and Mark's flashlight suddenly flickered and died. "We need to get out of here," I said, my voice trembling. But just as we reached for the front door, it slammed shut with a deafening bang. We pulled and tugged, but it wouldn't budge. Panic set in as we realized we were trapped, and that's when the real terror began. The house came alive. The whispers grew louder, now filling every corner of the room. Shadows danced along the walls, twisting and writhing in unnatural ways. I could feel someone watching us, breathing down our necks. Scott ran to the window, trying to break it open, but the glass wouldn't shatter. No matter how hard he hit it, the house seemed to resist any attempt at escape. Suddenly, the lights flickered, and in the brief flashes of light, we saw them. The figures, pale, ghostly figures, standing at the edge of the room, watching us. They were dressed in old-fashioned clothes, their faces twisted in pain, their eyes hollow and empty. We backed away, but they moved closer. Every time the lights flickered, they were nearer, their forms becoming more distinct, more solid. And then, one of them spoke. "Why are you here?" The voice was cold, hollow, and it echoed through the room, freezing us in place. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The figure reached out, its bony hand inches from my face, and I felt an icy chill shoot through my body. "We have to go," Jenny screamed, snapping me out of my paralysis. We ran, scrambling for any exit we could find, but the house seemed to be alive, shifting and closing in on us. Every door we opened led to another dead end, and the figures were closing in. In a last-ditch effort, Scott kicked down a door leading to the basement. It was a terrible idea, but we had no choice. We rushed down the stairs, the cold, damp air hitting us like a wall. The basement was worse, dark, cold, and filled with old, rotting furniture. And in the far corner, a large ancient mirror stood, its surface cracked and covered in dust. As soon as we entered, the door slammed shut behind us, trapping us inside. The figures appeared again, their reflection visible in the mirror, but this time, they didn't stay still. They moved toward the mirror, reaching out as if trying to pull themselves through. "We have to destroy it," Mark said, grabbing a nearby chair and smashing it into the mirror. The glass shattered, and for a moment, the figures vanished. But the relief was short-lived. The house groaned, and the walls began to close in. With no other options, we huddled together, bracing for whatever was coming. The air grew colder, the shadows darker, and just when I thought it was over, the door to the basement flew open. We didn't question it. We ran. As we burst through the front door and into the night, I looked back at the house. The figures were there, standing in the doorway, watching us as we fled into the darkness. We never spoke about what happened at Blackwood Manor, but every time I close my eyes, I see them, the figures, the whispers, the shadows, and I know deep down that the house is still waiting for someone else to come inside. I had always been drawn to the rich history and vibrant culture of New Orleans, but nothing could have prepared me for what happened when I agreed to stay in the old Creole townhouse in the French Quarter. It was supposed to be a weekend getaway with my two best friends, Claire and Ethan, filled with jazz, food, and exploring the haunted legends of the city. Little did I know, we would become part of that legend ourselves. The house we rented stood at the edge of Bourbon Street, a narrow 3-story townhouse that had been around since the 1800s. Its wrought iron balconies were covered in vines, and its exterior had a worn charm, like a place that had seen too many years. The owner told us it had once been home to a wealthy Creole family, but after a series of unexplained deaths, it had fallen into disrepair. Locals whispered about the house, claiming it was cursed, but we didn't think much of it. After all, New Orleans was known for its ghost stories. The first day was uneventful. We spent the afternoon touring the French Quarter, soaking in the sounds of the city, eating beignets, and enjoying the vibrant energy. By the time we returned to the townhouse, it was late, and the streets had emptied. The house, however, felt different at night. The lively energy outside seemed to vanish as soon as we stepped inside, replaced by an overwhelming stillness. It wasn't until we were all settled in for the night that things began to feel off. Claire and I were sharing the master bedroom on the second floor, while Ethan had taken the guest room next to us. The house was quiet, too quiet. Even with the windows open, I couldn't hear any of the usual sounds from the street below. No laughter, no music, just silence. Around midnight, I woke up to a strange noise. It was faint at first, like a soft scratching sound coming from the wall next to the bed. I sat up listening, but Claire was fast asleep. The scratching grew louder, more insistent, as if something was trying to claw its way through the wall. My heart raced, and I shook Claire awake. "Do you hear that?" I whispered. She groggily sat up, but the noise stopped as soon as she stirred. "What are you talking about?" she mumbled, already drifting back to sleep. I tried to brush it off as my imagination, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. The next morning, I mentioned the noise to Ethan, but he laughed it off. "It's an old house," he said. "It's probably just rats or something." We spent the day visiting the famous St. Louis cemetery and exploring the dark, twisted history of the city. Ethan joked about us turning into ghost hunters, but as the sun began to set, I couldn't shake the unease I felt about the house. That evening, we sat in the living room, sharing a bottle of wine and talking about the day's adventures. As we laughed and swapped stories, the room grew colder, unnaturally so. Claire noticed it first, shivering and wrapping herself in a blanket. "Is it just me, or is it freezing in here?" she asked. Ethan checked the thermostat, but it was set to a comfortable temperature. The chill seemed to seep in from the walls, creeping through the cracks and filling the room with a sense of dread. Suddenly, the lights flickered, and we all froze. The laughter died in our throats as the room plunged into darkness. The lights came back on a moment later, but something had changed. The atmosphere in the house felt heavy, oppressive. I glanced at the wall where I had heard the scratching the night before, and my blood ran cold. Faint, jagged lines were etched into the plaster, like claw marks, and they hadn't been there earlier. "What the hell?" I muttered, pointing to the wall. Claire and Ethan stared in shock, but before we could react, we heard a loud thud from upstairs. It sounded like something heavy had fallen to the floor, but we were the only ones in the house. Ethan grabbed a flashlight, and we cautiously made our way up the narrow staircase. As we reached the second floor, the temperature dropped even further. I could see my breath in the air, and the walls seemed to close in on us. The noise had come from the guest room, Ethan's room. The door was slightly ajar, and I could feel the icy air seeping out. Ethan pushed the door open, and what we saw inside made my stomach turn. His suitcase had been thrown across the room, clothes strewn everywhere. But that wasn't the worst part. In the center of the room, carved into the wooden floor, was a single word: "Leave." We stood frozen in horror, our minds racing. There was no logical explanation for what we were seeing. "We need to get out of here," Claire whispered, her voice trembling. But Ethan, ever the skeptic, shook his head. "It's just some prank," he insisted, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. "Someone's messing with us." That night, none of us could sleep. We stayed together in the living room, every creak and groan of the house setting us on edge. Around 3 a.m., the scratching started again, but this time, it wasn't confined to the walls. It came from all around us, the ceiling, the floors, even the furniture. Suddenly, the chandelier above us began to sway, as if something invisible had brushed against it. And then, without warning, it crashed to the floor, shattering into pieces. We jumped to our feet, but before we could move, the front door slammed shut with a deafening bang. "Get out!" a voice hissed, low and guttural, echoing through the room. It sounded like it was coming from the very walls themselves. We didn't need to be told twice. We grabbed our things and ran for the door, but it wouldn't budge. It was as if the house itself was trapping us, holding us prisoner within its cursed walls. The temperature continued to drop, and I could feel the presence of something malevolent closing in. Shadows danced along the walls, and the air grew thick with the scent of decay. Just when I thought we were done for, the door flew open, and we stumbled out into the cool night air. We didn't stop running until we were several blocks away, the house looming behind us like a dark specter. We never spoke of what happened in that house. We returned to our normal lives, but I could never shake the feeling that something had followed us. I still have nightmares about the townhouse in the French Quarter, and sometimes I wake up to the sound of scratching in the walls. I know one thing for sure: I will never set foot in New Orleans again. Blackwood Manor might have its legends, but nothing compares to the terror of the cursed house on Bourbon Street. It all started as a spontaneous road trip to San Francisco. My friends, Jess, Nate, and I needed a break from the mundane, so we decided to explore the West Coast. We were excited to visit the Golden Gate Bridge, Alcatraz, and the famous hilly streets of the city. But as we were searching for an affordable place to stay, we stumbled upon a listing on a local site. A beautiful old Victorian house in the Nob Hill neighborhood, known for its historic charm. It seemed perfect, almost too perfect. The listing was oddly cheap for the location, but we didn't think much of it. We were young and carefree, just looking for a cool place to crash for a few nights. The pictures showed a pristine, well-kept home with tall windows, intricate woodwork, and a view of the bay. Without hesitation, we booked it. When we arrived, the house was even more impressive in person, but it had an unsettling aura. It was massive, with a grand entrance, a staircase that spiraled upward, and rooms filled with antique furniture. It looked like something out of a Gothic novel, but still, we brushed off the eerie vibe and made ourselves at home. That night, we sat in the spacious living room, sharing a bottle of wine and talking about our plans for the next day. The conversation was light, but there was an unshakable feeling of being watched. It started with small things. Nate noticed a chill in the air, despite the warmth outside. Jess commented on how the house seemed too quiet, even for being in the middle of a bustling city. It was as if the walls were absorbing every sound. Later, I found a dusty old journal in one of the bookshelves. Curious, I opened it. The handwriting was nearly illegible, but one entry stood out. It was dated from the early 1900s and described a series of tragic deaths that had taken place in the house. A family of 5, all found dead in their beds, with no explanation. The neighborhood called it the Silent Hill House because after the deaths, no one dared to speak about what happened there. I told Jess and Nate about the journal, but they just laughed, saying it was probably some creepy story left behind to mess with guests. I laughed with them, but the feeling in my gut told me otherwise. It wasn't until the second night that things took a dark turn. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to the sound of scratching, faint but unmistakable, like nails dragging across wood. At first, I thought it was just an old house settling, but the sound didn't stop. It seemed to move, starting from the floor near my bed and creeping toward the walls. I froze, listening intently, hoping it was just my imagination. But then I heard a soft whisper, a voice so low I couldn't make out the words, but it sounded desperate, pleading. My heart pounded in my chest, and I bolted up, turning on the bedside lamp. There was nothing there, but the scratching continued. The next morning, I told Jess and Nate about what I heard. Nate shrugged it off, claiming old houses creak all the time, but Jess looked pale. She admitted she had heard something too, a voice, but in her dream. It called her name over and over until she woke up in a cold sweat. We agreed to explore the house that day, hoping to find some logical explanation for what we were experiencing. As we moved from room to room, the unsettling feeling grew stronger. In one of the smaller bedrooms, we found something that made my blood run cold. Faint claw marks on the floor, similar to the sound I had heard the night before. They were long, deep scratches, like something had been desperately trying to escape. That night, everything went to hell. Around midnight, we were sitting in the living room, trying to distract ourselves with a movie. But halfway through, the TV flickered, then turned off on its own. The room grew colder, and suddenly, the scratching sound started again, louder this time, coming from the walls, the ceiling, the floors. "Is this some kind of joke?" Nate said, standing up, his voice trembling with a mixture of anger and fear. Before I could respond, the lights began to flicker, casting eerie shadows around the room. Jess clung to my arm, her face pale. The scratching was relentless now, like something was crawling inside the walls, desperate to get out. Then we heard it. Footsteps on the staircase. Slow, deliberate, as if someone was coming down to meet us. We stared at the dark hallway, hearts pounding, waiting for whatever was there to reveal itself. Out of nowhere, the door to the living room slammed shut with a deafening bang, trapping us inside. The lights went out completely, plunging the room into total darkness. Jess screamed, and I could feel her trembling next to me. Nate rushed to the door, pulling at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. And then we heard the voice. It was a woman's voice, echoing through the room like a distant whisper. "Leave. Now." Panic set in. The room felt like it was closing in on us, the air thick with the presence of something evil. I grabbed Jess's hand, and together we ran toward the windows, hoping to escape that way. But as soon as we reached them, they slammed shut on their own, trapping us inside. Nate pounded on the door, screaming for help, but the house absorbed every sound. The footsteps grew louder, as if whoever or whatever was on the stairs was getting closer. In a desperate move, I grabbed a chair and threw it at the window. The glass shattered, and without thinking, we climbed out onto the fire escape. The moment we stepped outside, the air felt different, lighter, as if the oppressive force of the house couldn't reach us there. We ran through the streets of San Francisco, not stopping until we reached a well-lit area near a bar. None of us spoke as we tried to catch our breath, the terror still fresh in our minds. The next day, we left the city. None of us wanted to stay in San Francisco any longer, and we swore we would never speak of what happened in that house. But the nightmares continued, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed us. I tried to research the history of the house, but the records were vague, as if the city itself wanted to forget its dark past. Some people online claimed the house had been demolished years ago, but I knew that couldn't be true. We had been there. We had lived through it. To this day, I can still hear the scratching in the walls when I close my eyes. And sometimes, in the dead of night, I hear a whisper, faint but unmistakable, calling my name. The Silent Hill House of San Francisco is still out there, waiting for its next victims.
Lisa had always prided herself on her work ethic. As the new marketing manager at a mid-sized tech firm, she often stayed late at the office to ensure everything was perfect. The building was located in a quiet part of town, and as the clock approached midnight, the streets outside would be deserted, leaving the office eerily silent. She didn't mind the solitude. In fact, she found it calming. But that night, something was different. It was a Friday, and everyone else had left hours ago to enjoy the weekend. Lisa had a big presentation on Monday and wanted to get everything ready. The hum of the fluorescent lights above was the only sound in the large, open office space. She sat at her desk, her fingers flying across the keyboard, completely absorbed in her work. The quietness of the office had always been a sanctuary, but as the minutes ticked by, she couldn't shake the growing unease that crept over her. Suddenly, she heard a faint noise. It was subtle, almost like the creaking of a floorboard, but in an office with thick carpeting that shouldn't have been possible. Lisa froze, her fingers hovering above the keyboard. She listened intently, but the sound didn't come again. Shrugging it off as her imagination, she returned to her work. A few minutes later, the sound came again, louder this time, like something or someone was moving slowly through the office. Lisa's heart began to race. She stood up and looked around the dimly lit office. Rows of empty desks stretched out before her, illuminated only by the glow of her computer screen and the few overhead lights that were still on. Nothing seemed out of place, but the sense of being watched grew stronger. "Is someone there?" Lisa called out, her voice echoing through the empty office. Silence answered her. She shook her head, chiding herself for being paranoid. But as she sat back down, the air felt heavy, charged with an almost tangible sense of dread. Lisa tried to focus on her work, but the unease gnawed at her. The creaking noise came again, closer this time. She grabbed her phone and checked the time, nearly 1 a.m. She needed to leave, but the idea of walking through the dark, empty office terrified her. Gathering her courage, Lisa stood up, intending to grab her things and go. As she reached for her coat, the lights flickered and went out, plunging the office into darkness. Panic surged through her as she fumbled for her phone to use as a flashlight. Her breathing quickened, and her hands trembled as she swiped the screen, trying to bring up the light. Just as she managed to turn on the flashlight, she heard a whisper, a soft, raspy voice that seemed to come from the shadows behind her. "You shouldn't be here." Lisa spun around, her phone's light cutting through the darkness, but there was no one there. She pointed the light toward the back of the office where the sound had come from and saw something that made her blood run cold. In the far corner, near the supply closet, a shadowy figure stood, barely visible in the dim light. It was tall and thin, with unnaturally long limbs that seemed to blend into the darkness. The figure didn't move, but stood there, watching her. Lisa's mind raced. She was alone in the office. There was no way someone else could be there. She wanted to scream, to run, but her feet felt like they were glued to the floor. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound, but its presence was overwhelming, suffocating. Gathering every ounce of strength, Lisa forced herself to move. She backed away slowly, keeping the light trained on the figure. As she did, the figure began to dissolve into the shadows, like smoke dispersing in the air. Within seconds, it was gone, leaving only the oppressive darkness behind. Lisa didn't wait to see if it would return. She grabbed her bag and bolted for the door, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst. She practically flew down the stairs, not daring to look back. The The building was deathly silent as she reached the ground floor and sprinted out the front doors into the cool night air. When she finally reached her car, she locked the doors and sat there, her hands shaking uncontrollably. She didn't know what she had seen, but it had been real. As she drove home, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being followed, that the shadowy figure was lurking just beyond the reach of her headlights. For the rest of the weekend, Lisa tried to convince herself it was just a hallucination brought on by stress and fatigue. But when she returned to work on Monday, she found it impossible to go back to her routine. The office felt different, darker, more oppressive. She couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, and every small noise set her on edge. A few days later, she found out why. One of her co-workers, an older man named Frank, noticed her jumpiness and asked if she was okay. Reluctantly, Lisa told him about her experience that night, expecting him to laugh it off. But instead, Frank's face grew pale. "That's not the first time someone's seen something here," he said quietly. "Years ago, before this company moved in, this building was a psychiatric hospital. It closed down after a series of incidents. Some people say the spirits of the patients never left." Lisa felt a chill run down her spine. She had heard rumors about the building's history but had never taken them seriously. Now she couldn't ignore the cold, hard truth. She quit her job a week later, unable to bear another night in that haunted office. But the shadowy figure she had seen never left her mind. Even now, she sometimes catches glimpses of it in the corners of dark rooms, in reflections in windows, always watching, always waiting. Ethan was a security guard at an old, sprawling warehouse on the outskirts of town. The building was a relic from the 1950s, with long, echoing corridors and countless rooms filled with forgotten inventory. It was a quiet job, especially on the night shift, but Ethan didn't mind. He enjoyed the solitude, the stillness that the night brought. His shift started at 10 p.m. and ended at 6 a.m., and the routine was always the same: patrol the perimeter, check the surveillance cameras, and ensure that the building was secure. Most nights, nothing happened. The warehouse was as lifeless as the boxes it stored. But one night, as the clock ticked toward midnight, something changed. Ethan was doing his rounds, walking through one of the many deserted corridors. The dim lights overhead flickered as he passed, casting long shadows on the walls. He had his flashlight in hand, more out of habit than necessity. The building was always quiet, save for the hum of the fluorescent lights. As he reached the end of the corridor, he heard a sound. A faint, distant thud, like something heavy falling to the ground. Ethan froze, straining to listen. The warehouse was massive, and it wasn't uncommon for old boxes to topple over, but this sounded different. It was heavier, more deliberate. He turned around, pointing his flashlight down the darkened hallway. The beam cut through the gloom, but there was nothing there. The sound didn't come again, so Ethan shrugged it off and continued his patrol. But as he moved on, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The air felt colder, thicker, and there was an unsettling stillness that seemed to hang over the place. He quickened his pace, eager to finish his rounds and get back to the security office. When he reached the next corridor, the feeling of unease intensified. The walls seemed to close in on him, and the flickering lights cast eerie shadows that danced just at the edge of his vision. As he walked, he heard footsteps echoing behind him. They were soft, almost imperceptible, but they were there. Ethan stopped and turned around, shining his flashlight down the corridor. The beam revealed nothing but an empty hallway, stretching into darkness. His heart began to race as the footsteps continued, this time coming from the direction he had just turned away from. It was as if someone, or something, was playing with him. Deciding he had had enough, Ethan started back toward the security office. The footsteps followed, growing louder and more insistent. He broke into a jog, then a run, the sound of his own footsteps mingling with the ones that pursued him. He didn't dare look back. He just wanted to reach the safety of the office. When he finally burst through the door, he slammed it shut and locked it, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The small room was lit by the glow of the surveillance monitors, each screen showing a different part of the warehouse. He quickly scanned the feeds, looking for any sign of what had been following him. At first, there was nothing out of the ordinary. The cameras showed empty corridors and rooms, just as they always did. But then, on one of the screens, he saw it, a dark figure standing at the end of the hallway he had just been in. It was tall and featureless, more like a shadow than a person, but its presence sent a jolt of fear through Ethan. The figure didn't move, didn't even seem to be aware of the camera, but Ethan knew it was the source of the footsteps. He watched, transfixed, as the figure slowly began to move, gliding down the hallway toward the camera. It moved with an unnatural, fluid motion, as if it was floating just above the ground. Ethan's hands trembled as he reached for the radio to call for backup, but when he tried to speak, no sound came out. His throat was dry, his voice stolen by fear. He could only watch as the figure drew closer and closer to the camera until it was right in front of the lens. And then suddenly, the camera feed cut out, plunging the room into darkness. The monitors flickered, the screens going to static before one by one, they all went black. Ethan was left in the pitch-black room, the only sound the pounding of his own heart. Desperation took over as he fumbled for his flashlight, switching it on and shining it around the room. The beam revealed nothing but empty walls, but he knew the figure was out there, somewhere in the darkness. The silence was oppressive, suffocating, and he could feel the weight of unseen eyes watching him. Then, without warning, the door to the security office creaked open. Ethan's flashlight flickered as he pointed it toward the door, but he saw nothing. Just an empty doorway leading back into the dark, echoing corridors of the warehouse. But he could feel it. The presence was closer now, just beyond the threshold, waiting for him. The temperature in the room dropped suddenly, his breath visible in the beam of the flashlight. The radio crackled to life, emitting a low, static-filled whisper. The voice was faint, almost unintelligible, but Ethan could make out one word: leave. With every ounce of courage he had left, Ethan bolted for the exit. He ran through the darkened corridors, the feeling of being pursued growing stronger with every step. The footsteps were back, faster and louder, chasing him down the maze of hallways. He didn't stop until he reached the main entrance, practically throwing himself through the door and into the cold night air. Gasping for breath, he turned to look back at the warehouse. It loomed in the darkness, silent and still, but he knew he could never go back. Whatever was in there had let him leave, but he had no doubt that if he ever returned, it wouldn't let him escape again. Ethan quit his job the next day, leaving without a word to his employer. He didn't care about the paycheck or the explanation. All he wanted was to forget the terror that lurked in the shadows of that warehouse. But no matter how far he went, the memory of that night stayed with him, a haunting reminder of the darkness that sometimes resides in the most unexpected places. Lena worked as the night janitor at the Thompson office building, a towering structure in the heart of the city. The building, once a bustling hub of business activity, had fallen on hard times. Many of its floors were vacant, the offices abandoned, with only a few companies still occupying the upper levels. This made Lena's job eerily quiet, especially during her late shifts when the entire building seemed to belong to her alone. She had taken the job because it paid well and fit her schedule, but she couldn't deny the creeping unease she felt each night as she cleaned the deserted halls and empty rooms. The corridors, lined with old, flickering fluorescent lights, stretched out like endless tunnels, and the silence was oppressive. But Lena was practical, not easily frightened. She focused on her work, determined to finish her shift and go home to her small apartment. One evening, as she was cleaning the lobby on the ground floor, the building's security guard, Paul, approached her. He was an older man, gruff but friendly, and they often exchanged small talk during her breaks. "Hey, Lena," Paul said, his voice carrying a hint of concern. "You be careful tonight, okay? I've been hearing strange noises coming from the lower levels." "The lower levels?" Lena asked, raising an eyebrow. "You mean the basement?" Paul nodded. "Yeah, but it's probably just some rats or something. Still, just be careful if you need to go down there. The place gives me the creeps." Lena shrugged it off with a nervous laugh. She didn't plan on going to the basement if she could help it. The place was a labyrinth of dark, narrow hallways filled with old storage rooms, and she avoided it whenever possible. As the night wore on, Lena went about her routine, mopping the floors, emptying trash cans, and wiping down surfaces. Around midnight, she reached the 12th floor, one of the vacant levels. The offices there had been empty for months, their furniture covered in dust and their windows streaked with grime. The place had a musty, stale odor, like old paper and forgotten memories. Lena was about halfway through her cleaning when she heard it, a faint, distant sound. It was so soft that at first she thought she had imagined it, but then it came again, a low, rhythmic thumping. She paused, listening intently, trying to pinpoint where the noise was coming from. It seemed to be coming from below her, echoing up through the floor. Lena frowned, wondering if something had fallen over in one of the storage rooms, but then she remembered Paul's warning about the basement. A shiver ran down her spine, but she shook it off. She had a job to do, and there was no sense in letting her imagination get the best of her. Still, as she moved to the next office, the sound persisted, growing louder and more insistent. It wasn't just a thump, it was more like a dull pounding, like someone was hitting something heavy against a solid surface. It was a rhythmic, deliberate noise, each impact sending a faint vibration through the floor. Curiosity got the better of her. Lena grabbed her flashlight and headed for the stairs. She descended to the ground floor where the noise was louder still. It seemed to be coming from below, from the basement. She hesitated at the top of the stairwell, her heart beating faster. The darkness below was thick and suffocating, the stairs leading down into a black void. But Lena wasn't one to back down from a challenge. She took a deep breath and started down the stairs, the beam of her flashlight cutting through the darkness. As she descended, the sound grew louder, more distinct. It was definitely coming from the basement, and it was getting closer. When she reached the bottom of the stairs, she found herself in a long, narrow hallway, lined with old, rusting doors. The air was thick with the smell of damp concrete and mildew. The pounding sound echoed through the corridor, coming from one of the rooms further down the hall. Lena walked cautiously toward the source of the noise, her flashlight beam trembling slightly as she moved. She could feel the cold, oppressive air pressing in on her, and the silence between the pounding was so deep it hurt her ears. She reached the end of the hallway and found herself standing in front of a large metal door, slightly ajar. The sound was coming from inside the room beyond. Lena hesitated for a moment, every instinct telling her to turn back, but she pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was large, filled with old filing cabinets and dusty shelves. In the center of the room stood a massive, ancient boiler, its metal surface pitted and rusted. The pounding was coming from the other side of the boiler, a steady, relentless rhythm. Lena walked around the boiler, her flashlight casting long, eerie shadows on the walls. As she rounded the corner, she froze, her breath catching in her throat. There, in the corner of the room, was a figure, a man hunched over with his back to her. He was dressed in tattered, old-fashioned clothes, his hands bloodied and raw as he pounded them against the concrete wall. The sound of his fists hitting the wall echoed through the room, a sickening, wet thud with each impact. "Sir?" Lena's voice was barely more than a whisper, but it was enough to make the man stop. He slowly turned to face her, and Lena felt a wave of cold dread wash over her. His face was gaunt and pale, his eyes sunken and hollow. His mouth hung open as if in a silent scream, and blood trickled from his cracked lips. But it was his eyes that terrified her the most, empty, lifeless, and filled with a deep, unimaginable sorrow. Lena stumbled back, her flashlight flickering as her hand shook. The man took a step toward her, his movements slow and deliberate, like a predator stalking its prey. "No," Lena whispered, backing away. She turned and ran, her heart pounding in her chest. She fled down the hallway, up the stairs, and through the darkened corridors of the building, not daring to look back. She didn't stop running until she burst through the front doors of the office building and into the night. She leaned against the cold stone wall, gasping for breath, her mind racing. When she finally looked back at the building, it was dark and silent, just as it had been when she started her shift. There was no sign of the man, no indication that anything was wrong. Lena quit her job the next day. She didn't bother explaining why. She just couldn't bear the thought of stepping foot in that building again. But even as she tried to move on with her life, the memory of that night haunted her. She couldn't forget the man's lifeless eyes, the sound of his fists pounding against the wall. And every now and then, when she was alone in the silence of her apartment, she would hear it again, a faint rhythmic thudding echoing through the walls, as if the man had followed her home, still trapped in his endless torment.
I was 20 when I first moved into my own place, a small, cozy apartment on the outskirts of town. It was a quiet area, surrounded by trees and far enough from the main roads that the only sounds at night were the occasional rustling of leaves and distant hum of passing cars. It felt like the perfect escape from the bustle of the city, a place where I could finally have some peace and quiet. One Friday night, after a long week at work, I decided to stay in, watch a movie, and relax. The clock read 11:30 p.m. when I finally turned off the TV, feeling drowsy. I went through my nightly routine and crawled into bed, looking forward to a good night's sleep. Just as I was about to drift off, I heard a knock at the door. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. It was late, too late for someone to be knocking on my door. I stayed still, hoping that maybe it was just my imagination. But then the knock came again, louder this time, followed by a muffled voice. "Hey, are you in there? I need help." The voice was deep, male, and unfamiliar. I felt a chill run down my spine. I lived alone, and no one should be visiting me at this hour. My first instinct was to ignore it, but the knocking persisted, becoming more insistent. "Please, I just need to use your phone. My car broke down." Something about the situation felt off. My apartment was at the end of a long driveway, and there was no way someone would just stumble upon it. And why wouldn't he have a cell phone of his own? I reached for my phone and checked the peephole, holding my breath. Standing outside was a tall man, his face partially obscured by the shadow of a hood. He was pacing back and forth, his movements agitated. Every alarm bell in my head was going off, telling me to stay away from the door. I quietly backed away, trying to keep calm. I decided to call the police, but before I could dial, the knocking stopped. The sudden silence was unnerving. I listened, straining to hear any sound, but there was nothing. Then, I heard a new sound, a scraping noise coming from the back of the apartment, where the kitchen window was. My blood ran cold as I realized what was happening. He was trying to find another way in. I moved quickly, grabbing a kitchen knife for protection. I could hear the sound of something tapping against the glass, followed by a quiet curse. He was struggling with the lock. "Get out of here!" I shouted, my voice trembling. "I've called the police." There was a pause, and for a moment, I thought he might leave. But then, with a sudden violent crash, the window shattered. I screamed, backing into the living room as I heard him climb through the broken glass. My heart pounded in my chest as I desperately looked for a way out. The front door was too far, and he was already in the apartment. I could hear his heavy footsteps in the kitchen, getting closer. I ran to the bedroom and slammed the door shut, locking it behind me. My hands were shaking so badly that I almost dropped the knife. I backed up against the wall, holding my breath, trying to stay as quiet as possible. The footsteps stopped outside my door. There was a moment of eerie silence, then a soft knock. "Come on out," the man said, his voice calm, almost coaxing. "I'm not going to hurt you. I just want to talk." The doorknob rattled as he tried to open the door, and I pressed myself harder against the wall, hoping it would somehow keep him out. The wood creaked as he leaned against the door, his breath heavy and labored. I had to do something. I couldn't just sit there and wait for him to break down the door. My eyes darted to the window in the bedroom, and I realized it was my only chance. I quickly unlocked it and pushed it open, glancing back at the door as I did. The man must have heard the window because he started banging on the door, trying to force it open. I climbed out of the window, the cold night air hitting me as I dropped to the ground. The bushes scratched at my legs, but I didn't care. I had to get away. I ran through the backyard, not daring to look back, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I reached the edge of the property and darted into the woods, the trees providing some cover. I kept running, my mind racing, trying to figure out what to do next. I didn't have my phone, and the nearest neighbor was at least a mile away. As I ran, I could hear footsteps behind me, crashing through the underbrush. He was chasing me. I pushed myself to go faster, my legs burning with the effort. The footsteps were getting closer, and I could hear the man's labored breathing as he closed in on me. My lungs felt like they were on fire, but I couldn't stop. If I stopped, he would catch me. Suddenly, I saw a light up ahead, a faint, flickering light through the trees. It was the neighbor's house. I had to make it there. I could hear the man behind me, so close now that I could almost feel him reaching out for me. With one final burst of energy, I sprinted towards the light, bursting out of the woods and onto the neighbor's lawn. I screamed for help, hoping someone would hear me. The footsteps behind me stopped, and I turned around to see the man standing at the edge of the woods, just out of reach of the light. He didn't say anything, just stood there, watching me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. Then, without a word, he turned and disappeared back into the darkness. The door to the house opened, and the neighbor, an elderly man, stepped out with a flashlight, asking what was going on. I collapsed onto the ground, sobbing, trying to explain what had happened. The police arrived not long after, searching the area, but they found no sign of the man. I was too shaken to return to my apartment that night, so I stayed with the neighbors until morning. When the sun came up, I went back with the police, but nothing was missing. Nothing was disturbed, except for the broken kitchen window. I moved out of that apartment the next day, never looking back. I still don't know who that man was or what he wanted, but I know one thing for sure. If I hadn't escaped when I did, I might not be here to tell this story. Growing up, I lived in a quiet suburban neighborhood. Our house was a modest two-story, nestled at the end of a long, winding street. It was a peaceful place, the kind where everyone knew each other, and nothing ever seemed out of the ordinary. That is, until one fateful night when I was 17 years old. My parents were out of town for the weekend, attending a wedding. They trusted me to take care of the house, and I was looking forward to a quiet evening of watching movies and playing video games. It was around 10 p.m. when I decided to pause the movie I was watching and grab a snack from the kitchen. As I walked down the dark hallway, the faint sound of footsteps on the hardwood floor above me stopped me in my tracks. My heart skipped a beat. I knew I was alone in the house, or at least I thought I was. I stood there, frozen, trying to convince myself that it was just the house settling. But the footsteps continued, slow and deliberate, moving from one end of the upstairs hallway to the other. I grabbed a kitchen knife, my heart pounding in my chest. I crept up the stairs, each step feeling heavier than the last. As I reached the top, I noticed the door to my parents' bedroom was slightly ajar. The light was off, but I could see the faint outline of someone standing inside. The figure moved, and I quickly ducked behind the corner. My mind raced. Who could it be? How did they get in? I had locked all the doors, hadn't I? I took a deep breath and peeked around the corner again. The figure was now facing the door, their face obscured by shadows. Suddenly, the door creaked open wider, and the figure stepped out into the hallway. I could see now that it was a man, tall and gaunt, with wild, unkempt hair. He was holding something in his hand, something that glinted in the dim light. It looked like a knife. Panic set in. I was trapped. My only way out was past him, down the stairs and out the front door. But I knew I couldn't outrun him. I had to be smart. I silently backed into the guest bedroom and closed the door as quietly as I could. I locked it and pressed my ear against the door, listening. The footsteps grew closer. He was coming down the hallway, slowly, methodically, as if he knew exactly where I was. I backed away from the door, my hands shaking. There was no way out. The windows in the guest room were old and stuck. They wouldn't open. I was trapped. I heard him stop outside the door, my breath caught in my throat. There was a long, agonizing silence. Then suddenly, the doorknob rattled. I nearly screamed, but clamped my hand over my mouth to stifle the sound. The knob rattled again, harder this time, followed by a soft, menacing chuckle. Come out, wherever you are." The voice was low, raspy, and dripping with malice. I backed away, my eyes darting around the room for anything I could use to defend myself. There was nothing but old furniture and a dusty lamp. The door rattled again, this time with more force, as if he was trying to break it down. I knew I had to act fast. I grabbed the lamp and yanked the cord from the wall, holding it like a makeshift weapon. I backed into the farthest corner of the room, my eyes locked on the door, waiting for it to burst open. But then, the rattling stopped. The silence was deafening. I could hear my own heartbeat, loud and erratic. I waited, every muscle in my body tensed, expecting him to come crashing through at any moment. Minutes passed. Then I heard it, a soft creak, not from the door, but from the floorboards above me. I realized with a sickening dread that he had moved on. He was still in the house, but where? I waited for what felt like hours, my mind racing with terror. Finally, I heard the sound of a door closing somewhere downstairs. I crept to the window and peeked out, hoping to see him leaving. But the street was empty, and the house was silent once again. Gathering every ounce of courage, I slowly unlocked the door and stepped into the hallway. It was empty. I made my way downstairs, knife still in hand, and checked every room. The front door was wide open, a cold breeze blowing in from outside. He was gone. But the fear lingered, gnawing at the edges of my mind. I locked the door and called the police, my hands shaking uncontrollably as I explained what had happened. They arrived within minutes, but by then, the man was long gone. They searched the house and found no signs of forced entry, no evidence of who he was or why he had targeted me. But there was one thing they did find. On the floor of the guest bedroom where I had been hiding was a small, blood-stained note. It simply read, "Next time, you won't be so lucky." To this day, I still don't know who that man was or how he got into my house. But one thing is certain. I'll never forget the terror of that night and the feeling that, somewhere out there, he's still watching, waiting for another chance. I was 17 when my parents decided to take a last-minute weekend trip to visit some relatives out of state. They trusted me enough to leave me home alone, and I was excited about the idea of having the house to myself. I wasn't much of a party person, so I planned to spend the weekend binging horror movies and maybe inviting a couple of friends over. It was a quiet Friday evening when they left. The neighborhood was typically peaceful, and most of the houses were dark by 10 p.m. After making myself some popcorn, I settled down in the living room to watch one of my favorite horror flicks. The only light in the room came from the TV screen, casting eerie shadows on the walls. I was halfway through the movie when I heard a faint sound coming from the back of the house. It was a soft, repetitive tapping. At first I thought it was just the wind, but as the tapping continued, it became more deliberate, almost like someone was lightly knocking on the back door. My heart began to race, but I tried to brush it off, thinking maybe it was just a branch or something. But then, the tapping stopped, and there was a loud thud, as if something heavy had fallen against the door. I paused the movie, straining to listen. The house was completely silent now, except for the sound of my own breathing. I was about to get up and check it out when my phone buzzed on the coffee table. It was a text message from an unknown number. "Why don't you come to the back door?" Chills ran down my spine. I glanced at the time, 11:47 p.m. There was no way this was a coincidence. Someone was outside, and they were trying to lure me out. I typed a quick response, trying to keep my hands steady. "Who is this?" Almost immediately, I received another message. "Just come outside. I need to talk to you." I was terrified, but I didn't want to show it. My first instinct was to call the police, but I didn't want to overreact in case it was just a prank. Instead, I decided to ignore the texts and lock all the doors and windows in the house. I made my way to the back door, where the noise had come from earlier. The porch light was off, but I could see the silhouette of a figure standing just beyond the glass. I froze, my hand hovering over the lock. The figure didn't move, just stood there, staring at me through the glass. My phone buzzed again. "Let me in." I slowly backed away from the door, trying to make as little noise as possible. I had no intention of letting this person inside, whoever they were. I turned off the lights in the kitchen and tiptoed back to the living room, where I grabbed my phone and dialed 911. As I waited for the dispatcher to pick up, I heard the sound of glass shattering from the back of the house. The person was trying to break in. I ran upstairs and locked myself in my bedroom, my heart pounding in my chest. I whispered into the phone, trying to explain the situation to the dispatcher as quietly as possible. The dispatcher assured me that the police were on their way, but it would take at least 10 minutes for them to arrive. I didn't think I had that long. I heard footsteps on the stairs, slow and deliberate, like the person was taking their time. My bedroom door was the only thing separating me from whoever was in the house. The footsteps stopped right outside my door. I held my breath, praying that they would go away. But then, the doorknob slowly began to turn. I backed away, grabbing the nearest thing I could find, a heavy lamp, and held it up, ready to defend myself. The door creaked open, and a tall, shadowy figure stepped into the room. I couldn't see their face, but I could tell they were smiling, a creepy, almost sinister smile. They took a step closer, and I swung the lamp with all my strength, hitting them square in the head. The figure stumbled, but didn't go down. Instead, they reached out, grabbing my wrist with a cold, clammy hand. I screamed and yanked my hand away, backing up until I hit the wall. The figure lunged at me, and I swung the lamp again, this time connecting with their side. They let out a low growl and staggered back, giving me just enough time to run past them and out of the room. I raced down the stairs, hearing the figure crashing after me. I knew I couldn't outrun them for long, but I had to try. Just as I reached the front door, I heard sirens blaring in the distance. Relief washed over me as I flung the door open and ran outside, waving frantically at the approaching police cars. The officers jumped out and rushed towards the house, guns drawn. I watched from the safety of the driveway as they stormed inside. Moments later, they emerged, dragging the figure out in handcuffs. As they passed me, I finally got a good look at the intruder's face. It was the last person I expected to see, an old family friend who had helped my parents with some renovations years ago. I hadn't seen him in years, but he had always seemed so normal, so kind. The officers told me later that he had been stalking me for weeks, planning this night. They found a bag in his car filled with duct tape, rope, and other items that sent shivers down my spine. My parents rushed